Welcome to today's episode of the Rule Breakers podcast. And with me today is Alex Smith. And just prior to this call, Alex, I was trying to remember where our paths first crossed, but I know it was a long, long time ago, somewhere in the depths of something to do with electronic publishing or legal publishing or
I think it's tax publishing, wasn't it?
tax,
And accounting. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, well, adjacent. Yeah, yeah. That was probably back in the days when you'd spent quite some time with Lexis and associated companies, didn't you?
Yeah, I was 17 years at Lexis, so everywhere from books on screen to
Right.
re-platforming back in 2015 to kind of very, very, very rich XML environments. But yeah, I remember we first met on the project around tax and accounting standards and trying to turn them from PDFs into marked up XML to deliver to a couple of major customers through with your company.
But yeah, books on screen. That was Butterworth's, wasn't it? Back in the
Afterwards,
day.
books on screen, which then became net books on screen. So that was NetBoz. And then I think we eventually moved off in about 2005 onto the Lexis mainframe servers back in the day.
Right.
Which was, we had to move from XML. We were single sourcing at the time. I remember that was when I first joined. Single sourcing was the big rage to try and not reinvent every time you updated a CD.
Yeah. But I remember back in those early days with, of electronic publishing and the emergence of CD-ROMs as a kind of a distribution medium for, for technical content that's consumed by, lawyers, accountants, tax professionals, and so on. There was quite a few. There was an explosion of different viewers. So I remember it wasn't at all unusual to have a situation where, a company might say, start doing something and delivering it, say, as folio views, which was a big one at one stage. And now here comes, say, Microsoft Multimedia Viewer, and now here comes the web and so on. And like one of the main drivers for structured documents back in those early days was actually that whole idea of, write it once and then be able to press software Shazam buttons to get it into those different deliverables.
Yeah, it was. I think when I first joined, probably just as I was joining, it was send the print files from the typesetter to the CD-ROM team, who would then probably try to recapture the whole thing all over again each time. Right. I remember we went to single sourcing because I was in the editorial team initially, and we were doing single sourcing, but the single sourcing was Word files with styles, and we were trying to run schema matching on word styles to make sure that us editors didn't get the word styles wrong or do something naughty like, make characters invisible to make gaps appear and stuff, which would have been bit us on the ass a little bit later.
Yeah. I remember there were so many of those. There's so much work involved in trying to massage content coming from subject matter experts into the form that would be ideal for that, multi-platform publishing trick. But so many gotchas along the way. I remember things like, having characters in file names that were acceptable for one CD-ROM platform, but not acceptable for another. I remember once doing a CD-ROM publishing run where everything looked fine and everything passed my QA/QC tests. It was in the auditing and accounting space, now that I remember it. But my script, which was written in Perl, I believe, had silently removed all of the dollar signs from all of the tables.
I remember when we moved from that and we went to, as I said, the kind of global platform at the time for Lexis, and we had to move to XML. And I know certain other publishers had already been in, SHTML and other things before that. But we were moving from like styled Word and supposedly governed styled Word. But when we moved to XML, we sent everything out for capture from that style over into XML. And we got back this one file and it was literally just zeros were everywhere. And we were like going, what's going on? And then literally the editor had tried to make the Word pages look like the pages because they then sent them to an author. And the author was like, this doesn't look like the old page proofs I used to get to run through. So they'd basically put in zeros between square brackets, etc., and then turn them white. And so all the zeros came up in the XML because it was like we had to send it all back out for recapture. And it was like, it took us about 6 months to work out what the editor had done back in the day.
Yeah. it's gosh, it's such an interesting journey. I remember on the hardware side of all of this, yeah, I remember well, there were desktop computers, and then there were things called luggables.
Okay.
I remember the first one was from a company called Compaq, which I think was subsequently acquired by Hewlett Packard.
Mm.
But this was back in the day when um, that idea of like the auditor or an accountant or whatever going on site to do work
Yeah.
had a luggable, which was essentially a suitcase. Uh, but in said suitcase, was a laptop, which is, ridiculously heavy and big by today's standards. But then also then in that suitcase would be the um, the latest and greatest CD-ROMs
Yeah.
of the relevant material. And that would be, updated then, perhaps once a month. And I remember when one of the data captures that we did for one of the big four auditing and accounting firms once involved a yard of CD-ROMs. So,
Yeah, I can imagine.
and there was just monthly snapshots of all of the auditing and accounting guidance and the relevant tax legislation and so on.
Because we were doing with you guys, I remember we were trying to use web scraping as well, right? We were trying to go off to it's the IFRS website to they try and work out what the diffs were on the changes to diff the changes, because obviously they published it but never told you what actually changed on a page, whether the page changed and all of that kind of stuff. So I seem to remember we were going through lots of different techniques, like each rule set that we did with you was a different approach, using a different publishing thing, using a different, was it a website or a CD-ROM or something like that? But we were always trying to find the differences.
Yeah, indeed. It's funny, isn't it? Like sometimes, every major revolution that comes along is kind of, it's presented as being kind of, better than what we previously had, but I think invariably, even if the general trajectory is forward, I think there's always something that gets lost. Like so in the case of the CD-ROMs, for example, one of the things that came built into the limitation is that you could only write on it once, right? It was read only, and the limitation was therefore that you couldn't update it. But with that limitation came this beautiful side effect that if you needed to know what all of the tax legislation looked like August of last year, you reached for it on the shelf.
Yeah.
Because you had copies of it. And I mean, obviously we're going to talk about AI here in a minute, but I mean that's one of the things that's becoming increasingly problematic, I think, in this world where everything is just ones and zeros, and there's no tangible physical medium. It could be very, very, very difficult to be sure, especially if an organization that produces this kind of material has already jettisoned the concept of paper.
Yeah.
Like, in the event of a discrepancy, what is the ground truth, as the AI folks say? It's a hard problem.
I mean, we live in I now work for iManage, so kind of work in a kind of, in essence, a document management, email management environment for professionals that, their professional indemnity, their professional qualifications are tied to auditability, etc. But, some of the stuff that's changing there from, there is still, one of our strengths is versioning still, and many products don't have versioning.
Right.
But versioning is important. But even, as we start going to people co-authoring more and dual editing, even that versioning becomes incredibly fine-grained in terms of like, someone changed this every 5 seconds and etc.
Right.
So you are right. And people lose what is a version in some ways if you never, some of the more, younger generations don't really think about a version. They just go in and co-author away on the document. But actually, versions have very, very key importance in legal or tax proceedings, because this is what was said at this point in time.
Right. No, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that whole trend has happened simultaneously with a trend away from versioning software. I mean, these days, so my machine is running Windows 11 nominally as the top high level brand, but that's not really the version, right? If I wanted to know the real version, I'd have to go in and see.
Yeah.
And as software has become something that basically might change every Monday morning, not necessarily without your knowledge.
Yeah.
Good old version numbers have gone out the window. The other thing that this is going to sound like a bit of a rant now, but one of the things I do miss from the good old days is we had naming conventions back in the good old days, whereas now every URL for everything seems to be this, big opaque identifier.
Yeah.
Oh, and you can't reverse engineer out of it, any notion of what it might be or what date it might have been created on. And I kind of do miss those days. Uh,
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, it also goes between what types of content are we talking about? There's content which is very throwaway, especially in the internet era where it's a one-time only thing, a blog or something like that. But when you get into, here is a web page with a rule, and this rule is going to update for the next 20 years, you're kind of going back saying I'd still quite like a standard identifier, and I'd like the versioning in the numbering and all of those kind of things, because otherwise, this AI is not, you want the 100% option as opposed to a 70% accurate option.
right, indeed. I remember a Tim Berners, I think this is a Tim Berners-Lee quote. Cool URLs don't change, I think was the quote. I remember a period in time there where URLs would come with things like date stamps, built into them. I always had a soft spot for that. Especially, I'd spend a lot of time marking up legal materials, and which, as legal documents invariably have interdependencies.
Yeah.
So I'd be, for example, working on marking up, let's say, an auditing standard, and one auditing standard needs to refer to another auditing standard. And there was great comfort in knowing that if I knew what the link was going to be, even if that document didn't exist yet, I could put the link in because there were naming conventions that drove the whole thing. I think we've in recent years sort of swayed away from that a little bit, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if we make a move back in that general direction.
There's some still unsolved. I work in a much more unstructured world now with going to be in document management, and kind of whilst as the structure is in the document management system around matters and those containers, all the documents are just documents, and the Excel sheets are Excel sheets, etc. I do feel like in my world right now, there are unsolved problems which feel like a publishing problem. And some of those, for example, I'll give one example, which is, you and I might want to do a venture, so we sign a contract, and in 2 years' time, we want to re-sign the contract, but with slightly addended terms based on what we've learned and money and all of those things. And then 3 years after that, you might want to exit and someone else signs into that contract. Those three items are interrelated, right? Some of the original terms still stand. The terms that we've overwritten stand, and the terms we've then rewritten or changed a number, that's still an unsolved problem, right? That's an unsolved problem about how those things are connected, interrelated, etc. And in many ways in publishing, you wouldn't have that problem because you would have published it into a content management system, and those things would overwrite, and you'd have XML wrap around all those different aspects. So it's interesting when, I agree with you. I think some of the ways to solve some of this stuff are almost publishing, but in the real world of documents and how people interrelate around documents, no one's quite got the publishing principles yet. So, sometimes the old techniques come back round, and you're sort of explaining something from 2003 to someone who's much younger than you.
Right. Yeah, indeed. One of the things that it just intrigues me about the world of law, right, and auditing and accounting, I describe it as kind of white collar publishing, or stuff that people read because they have to for their job, not because they're reading it for pleasure, right? And typically stuff that can get really large, like hundreds of thousands of pages, it's not unusual. Like that. In that world, certainly the world of law has been historically, pretty slow to sort of jump on technological bandwagons. And some of the reasoning behind that perhaps is traceable back to good old fashioned concepts like the billable hour and so on, right? When law is an old profession, is operated the way it operated for a long time, and it's not going to get pushed around by any cool new technology, right? But this AI thing seems to have grabbed the attention of the legal world in a way that I don't think any previous technology did. Is that fair?
I think legal's an interesting one because I think lawyers we call them knowledge workers. It could be lawyers, could be accountants, etc. And you are right that those people are turning information, experience, collective experience into the reason why you go to a lawyer, right? It's not always, I think everyone has a view that a lawyer churns a contract, there's a contract. Actually, you're going to a lawyer for advice,
Right.
options, safety, whatever it may be. I think legal, they are quite a no bullshit community, right? And so kind of come with something that's not that interesting or something that doesn't help them, they will push it away. But I do think just one moment on the history, I think, obviously lawyers were some of the first people to pick up word processing back in the day, right? And so actually a lot of, the typewriter disappeared quite quickly. And it was a keyboard, etc. So they digitized quite early, and document management, for example, is going back to the 90s, for example, in terms of looking after electronic assets. I think the other area, obviously back into my Lexis days, was search, and you're back to your DVD, CD-ROMs, literally going from looking in 3 books, trying to find the cross-related answer and the case law and the citation and whatever. Lawyers were incredibly quick to pick up CD-ROMs because you could literally just put a word in, press a button, and suddenly you'd have 7 options and something across the spectrum. I think what's happening with AI in some ways, and it's kind of like, whilst I would love, and we come back to it, I would love lawyer. I think there's a lot of opportunity for law and accountancy around data and insights and analytics and all that kind of stuff, which could make them more investigating. I do think what's happened with this is that, and we kind of saw it as it was coming through, is it's very textual. This AI is textual rather than data. Right. And so suddenly the lawyers are seeing words appearing in front of them and they're like going, that's amazing. That's what I do. I create more words. I create assets. I create memos. I rewrite things. I redraft things. I make things precise. So I think it really tipped a nerve in many ways, in terms of, oh my God, that's what I do. I create words. I create sentences. I create all this stuff. So I think that's why this has really tipped an interest, because the outputs feel like my stuff, whereas previously probably AI was going, here's some data and here's a I don't know, a dashboard of my finance and billings and all that. That's fine, but that's not my output. Whereas this is very textual, and it feels like, how does it know how to do this? How does it put these patterns together? How does it predict the next word, sentence, etc.? So I think that's what's really, especially in knowledge work, it's gone, okay. That's my area, and the outputs look like my types of outputs. Now we can debate whether they are accurate and all that kind of stuff, but I think that's what's triggered people, and so suddenly everyone's gone, oh my God, I want the thing that creates or redrafts my email quickly, and so suddenly you've seen a lot of people jump onto that, whether it's specific AI tools like Harvey or Legora, or whether it's more general tools like ChatGPT or Claude.
Right. Indeed, yeah. One of the things that's always took me a while to wrap my head around it, having spent a lot of time working in the world of law and legal drafting, not in the sense of contract so much, but in the sense of legislation and
You guys are always doing the legislation drafting and all that, right?
But it took me a while for the penny to drop that the conceptual model that the lawyers were bringing to that problem was actually very structured. But it just wasn't structured in the way structure was explained to me in computer science class. Yeah. In particular, I think it finally dawned on me that essentially the main structural element that drives a lot of this is citation networks, right? The interconnections between things. And, if that piece of case law gets repealed, then it's got a knock-on effect on various memorandums that were written, And if you look at it from the perspective of the citation graph, and words are hanging off this citation graph, but then it becomes, I guess, what now is becoming quite a popular phrase out there in buzzword land. Knowledge graphs. It's like lawyers have a knowledge graph in their heads, and everything is understood with respect to how it impacts the knowledge graph. So. I think
there's a few things in that. Like I did knowledge graphs in 2016, and I just found them fascinating, like a recommenders.
Yeah.
And basically how you connect things which may not be connected, but they're connected through something else. So I kind of find that fascinating. It's almost back to, serendipity, like, how is so-and-so connected to so-and-so in that, your great cousin suddenly appears out of nowhere at the party and you're like, oh, we're related. And I think it's that, I find that really interesting, because I think that's how, as you said, knowledge is connected. It's not, and I think it goes beyond, let's say, citations. I think imagine your citation, your knock on in what you said, the law changes. Okay, that's great. Here's the law bit of the knowledge graph. But actually, that then impacts practice. So that's going to
Right.
impact your best practice and how you run things. But potentially, your clients need warnings on how you advise based on the previous regime or the previous regulatory approach. And now you've got risk, but you've also possibly got opportunity in terms of being able to go back and see that. And a lot of that, probably, as you said, is it's in the great lawyers' minds. The lawyers
Right.
fold that because they remember about so and so. They remember advising something. They remember, hey, if which option they gave a client three options, and the client chose option three,
Right.
and they'd advise them one and two are also options. And then remembering that piece, but it's not codified. It's
Right.
sitting in
Right.
a Word document, or even worse,
Right.
it's sitting in an email string because they advised within the email string, or they advised in person, right? A lot of legal advice is delivered in person, for example. So
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's fascinating. I do also think the other one is, interconnected pieces, because contracts I
Mm.
see as they are a series of what ifs. What if this happens? What if this happens? What if this happened? What happened? This happened. And what's interesting is when you think about how a lawyer puts that contract together, it's very structured.
Right. Right. Right.
They don't start on page one and finish
Right.
on
Right.
page
Right.
10. Even if they're taking a previous draft or a template or something, you're thinking through what might happen and
Yep.
let's think through the scenarios. Okay, if this company goes bust, this is what happens. If this happens, but it's just not in the logic's nowhere in it because they're in a Word document with styles. So
Right.
it's
Right. Right.
so it's kind of how you get from here into something maybe over time more codified.
Yeah. 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 One of the things that I think has been that other industries I think could learn from is things like uh, the blue book, for example, like
Yeah,
that idea that, well, if we're, as an industry, if we need to cite things, if we need to reference things,
yeah,
then having standards for how you do those references is a good idea for everyone.
yeah,
And I've always been intrigued with that idea that even baked into what sounds like a really old school notion now, like for example, page numbers in case law,
yeah.
is ultimately it's driven by this uh, desire to try and be able to pick out really, really, very, very specifically, you know, a particular piece that you might want to bring to the attention of a judge or whatever.
Yeah, it comes in. It's really funny when you look at some of, the last couple of years been doing kind of, people have been doing RAG stuff,
Yeah.
and, what it's doing in essence is finding underlying search results, still search, and then passing those bits of documents to an LLM to generate text or generate a new document, whatever it may be. And it's just quite funny, that the metaphor that's come out in the UI has been footnotes. And you're looking at it,
Right.
it's all bubble, you got the little number next to the sentence which has been generated, but there's a bubble showing you what part of the underlying
Yeah.
document or vector or embedding or just
Yeah.
plain snippeting, whatever it may be. But the metaphor's a footnote. And it's like,
Yeah. Yeah.
not
Yeah.
totally sure it is an academic footnote, and I'd love to
Yeah.
see it
Yeah.
tested in court. But
Yeah.
it's funny how that authority piece, that evidence piece, has come back round in terms of saying, if you, the machine, can go off and find all this stuff on the internet, tell me at least what you relied on when you wrote this sentence about X or a
Right.
product or whatever it may be. And so
Right.
again, how 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 you maintain the audit, and underneath of that, certain professions are going to then go, oh, but show me the search results and show me the actual documents. Let's see.
Yeah. 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 No, indeed. Indeed. And unfortunately, yeah, the reality of the way that these things work in terms of the probabilistic, how they arrive at the next word or whatever, um, means that their ability to hallucinate extends into those citations. There's been some well publicized examples of pieces of content that actually were quite reasonable, unless until you read the footnotes. And then
It's interesting 'cause I think there's a checking thing that's coming in. The big conversation at the moment is how much time does this save you? Let's say pretend we're on the efficiency rather than
yeah,
creative.
yeah,
What else could you do? How much time does this save you when you need to validate
yeah, yeah,
everything that's in there? And I think what's interesting is you look at some of these tools like Claude, which are now starting to predict skills and what do I do next and
mm,
etc. And what they want to do is reach out into structured databases. If there's a structured database, it wants to go and check, does this citation exist?
right,
Number one, right? The same things which AI could probably run through, pick out a judge's name, etc. But do we know if the judge still practices? Does the judge
yeah, yeah,
change?
yeah,
So you're still looking at entity lists and entity management and
yeah,
validation, etc. So I do. It's interesting where I think I was reading quite a funny one about Claude the other day, and kind of Claude's doing its picking skills and picking things to do, and apparently, one of the popular things is give it some of the old skills, right? Go, you want to pull something out. Okay, here's the regex skill because the regex skill is going to be pretty damn precise
yeah, yeah,
on the
yeah,
thing. So actually, what's interesting is the AI might start predicting some of the older techniques rather than the new techniques based on, hey, I want 100% confidence that I'm
right,
pulling out
right,
Alex Smith every time. I don't want Alexander Smith. I don't want Sandy Smith. I don't want Sandy Smythe. I literally
yeah.
just want Alexander Smith.
Yeah, 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 yeah. There's a whole new raft of disciplines, I think, that are going to emerge. Clearly, the AI thing is not going back in a box, right? That's not
No,
going to happen.
no.
Um, I read an interesting book recently called Reshuffle. I'm blanking on the name of the author now, but essentially the thesis is that AI solves certain problems, but it's almost like nuclear power, right? So nuclear power is amazing and also very dangerous.
Yeah,
So a whole new set of problems needed to be solved. If you like, radiation was kind of a side effect that we
yeah,
can't get rid of the radiation. Sorry. So now there's all of this technology and engineering required to deal with that side of things because nuclear power as a concept's not going back in the box.
yeah.
But AI feels like that to me, that some of the problems that are baked into it, rather than us, collectively saying, oh, gee, that means we need to go back, and stop using this stuff. I think it's more that we're going to find ways to work around the new problems that it creates.
Yeah. I don't think it's going to be, I think data is important, auditability is data important. The big word
Yeah.
this year is going to be context. Like
Yeah, yeah.
these things need a lot of context, otherwise you're passing the wrong data
Right.
into a tool that can do something. And however much you might cite it, like humans don't always check all the citations, they don't always check the pieces. So I think it's interesting what it forces you to think about. Kind of we're playing with some stuff. We have an internal knowledge base around like our sales materials, for example. But that's not all sales materials and decks and roadmaps and product stuff back 5 years, because if you do that, you're going to get answers from old things which are now out of
Right.
date. So even like the concept of managing the life cycle of an asset becomes really, really important, because you
Right.
want the AI pointing at stuff you trust, what if a knowledge bank is maintained as opposed to archived,
Right.
and so you're kind of going saying, I now have to have this. The other one that comes up quite a lot is these tools struggle that, you throw a lot of information at them, they'll process the information, come up with stuff incredibly quickly, but it can't, for example, it'll mangle things. So one that we see a lot is jurisdiction. So if you
Right.
stick in some Scottish legislation, some Welsh legislation, some English legislation without context, without where it is, ultimately it's going to mangle things together. So, what used to be a nice to have field that sat in one of your databases or a Lexis databases saying jurisdiction, suddenly, if you do not have jurisdiction sat on top of, a mixed section of an act, you're going to struggle. Or if you
Right.
suddenly throw a load of EU legislation in, you're now going to, blur your model. So a
Yeah.
lot of, things which were nice to have in terms of, the markup around a piece of data have suddenly become must have, because these
Must have.
machines they're fed information. If you feed it a load of the wrong information, it will come up with wrong outputs.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've moved from that. Was it Bill Gates? Is that one of his things? Content is king. We're definitely moving into content is king. Uh, that seems to be one of the main ways to drive better results from these things. But it's a discipline that's emerging literally as we speak.
Yeah.
But it's very exciting as well. I mean, I've seen some of the AIs, do things that have left my jaw on the floor. But at the same time, I've seen them do just incredibly stupid things. So
Yeah.
it's this strange mix. It's like we're dealing with, an absolute savant, um, but can't tie shoelaces. That kind of,
Yeah.
you know,
And it's also, I think people seem to still think, it's search or I mean, there is search under the bonnet of a lot of it, but they seem to think it's something that it's not. And
yeah,
I think people have to play. I've been playing with that stuff a lot, but I've been doing stuff where, let's take a transcript. I do customer interviews and things like that. Let's do a transcript, but I can come up with two entirely different consequences or the outputs. I can make it, hey, this person really loves my product, or I can equally say this person really hates my product, and it's just me on the prompt level saying, be negative or be positive or whatever it might be about it. And I think people don't seem to realize that the inputs are as important as the outputs to these things. And there is no, I don't want to say there is no truth, but there is technically no truth. I think the longer term consequences, I wouldn't want to be 25 right now, right? Looking at 30 odd years of my career ahead in this world. But I think in the short term, what you're going to see is a lot of senior people having more work because more juniors and other people can produce stuff faster. But there's a lot more checking that goes into that because people don't have the experience of writing a business case, but they can produce a business case. They don't know what's in it or the principles of the business case. So suddenly the senior people are going to be dealing with a lot more information very quickly.
indeed. Yeah. And the world of coding, which I still dip into, increasingly with the aid of the AIs, it's a very different profession now these days, in good ways and bad ways. But I've noticed, for example, that I go straight from an idea to a design to code review without the bit in the middle that used to consume a lot of time, right? Which is the coding. But various things are occurring to me, as this whole revolution evolves. But one of the ones that I've landed on is the whole non-determinism thing. That I think a really interesting way of mitigating the risks of the non-determinism is, instead of asking an AI, in my case, it would be something like, say, Claude Code. Instead of asking Claude Code a question or asking it to do something to a Word document, because it can munge Word documents, as I'm sure you know, and redline things and so on. Instead of asking it to do it, I'll ask it to write a Python program that would do it.
Yeah.
Because at least then I've turned it into something that's deterministic and auditable, to your earlier point about auditability,
Yeah.
So I think that's kind of an emerging pattern as well for how these things will get used.
Yeah, I think they'll interact as well. I think that's what's exciting, right? We always talk about eventually things go into the stack. For a while, something has a life form. Blockchain had a life form for a while, and obviously Gen AI has a life form where everyone has to use Gen AI. But eventually, all these things go into the stack, and then the stack is how it interacts. I think what's interesting is, can you orchestrate and kind of think about what the right tool is for the right job, right? You don't have to use non-deterministic stuff to extract something if you already know that the words are exactly the same every single time you want to extract. So now call the skill, which is the deterministic bit, but don't make me think about it, because
Don't make me think
these
about
tools can start to do that. But again, I think what's going to be interesting is how people understand the underlying information that they're pulling in and how much do they trust that information. And I think that's where I worry a little bit about people's information skills, what used to be known as research skills, but the information skills of what is a good source of information. I mean, legal went through it when Google came out, right? Everyone was saying, don't use Google because it's not the right information, and it cuts the results, and it makes choices which you should look through the 100 documents, whatever it may be. But people learn to understand what are the sources of good information, what are the bad information sources on Google or in an index. I think people are going to have to understand a little bit deeper how certain data sources interact with this and what's within the structure of those data sources. Now, I think some of that data source stuff can be done on the fly a bit more because of processing power. But I think a lot of it's going to be, do I trust this source? Does it have these types of metadata, which might probably won't be called metadata, it'll be called skills or context or some exciting word. It's just like at the moment everyone's talking about memory files, but in essence a memory file is a personalization piece saying who have I, what have I done, etc. It's new, people come up with new cool words for the old things.
Sure.
But I do feel like you're going to need to be able to know what's in a source. What's in a source? Does it have this type of information? Is it structured this way? How is it structured? What biases have gone into it by whoever's written it, created it? You see it a little bit also about AI building on top of AI generated content, and now we're starting to say, is this AI content or not?
Yeah, it's this recursive loops we seem to be landing ourselves into in terms of the AI consuming AI, but then also now the AI being very good at programming means the AI could be good at programming the next iteration of the AI.
Yeah.
Which has,
and what can it and can't it do? Like I'm seeing people, there's a little bit as you get older, you see the same loops going round. I mean, you mentioned it earlier, you see the same loops going round that whilst it's cool and new, but you're seeing the same loops. And one I'm seeing quite a bit at the moment is people, we can index everything and build knowledge bases by indexing the internet. And you're kind of going, and now up comes a grid, probably generated in Claude with a world map saying we've ingested the laws at A, B, C, and D. And then you're looking at it going, yeah, but I'm pretty sure that's unconsolidated legislation. You've just dumped into this. And I'm pretty sure that the answer is not going to be right because I'm pretty sure that data source is not consolidated or, and are you then going to consolidate that? And can these machines consolidate? I don't think they can.
No.
And so suddenly it's like, the old one of, I know now that the government website over in the UK now is updated. And that was a 20-year project with John Sheridan and team, right, to get that all done. But that's only quite recent that they're updated. I'm pretty sure other systems in the world probably not using your stuff are not consolidated. PDFs of, this is what it was in 72, but you've got to cross-reference that with 32 years worth of changes.
Yeah, I mean, it's that you've really hit on one of my buttons there because I'm amazed just how often I would come across that non sequitur. People think that just because they have all the promulgated legislation, for example, doesn't mean that you know what the legislation is today or at any previous, point time to. And some of the legislatures that we work with, for historical reasons have cycles that could leave their official publications to be anything like they could be 2 or 3 years out of date. That if consolidation, if it's done at all, is done periodically, it's definitely not contemporaneous. Now, obviously, that's the place where some of the legal publishers have filled a gap over the years. Even in the world of contracts that you described there, I mean, contracts that have got conditionals in them, it's really difficult. You can't just look at, even if it's the correct text of the contract, doesn't mean that the interpretation of it is, independent of time and space and,
it's interesting. They're kind of talking quite a lot. I mean, I know that there's stuff which isn't solved yet on what I'd call the basic level, like, is it classified and all those things. And then I think AI is getting there. I think what's interesting is kind of, what's within the four corners of a page, what's not in the four corners of a page. So, that's where you start to be able to, the knowledge graph stuff or just faster computing, which is computing what do we know about this deal that might be in Salesforce, that might be in somewhere else, etc. But then how do you tie that to the four corners of the page? And many of us have tried to do that for 20 odd years. And I think there's possibilities. I think the other interesting thing that's coming out, and I'm seeing it in, I think, Anthropic and some of the others, is they're realizing that why is a change important? It's not just that you can say what a change is, it's why. And in the contract world, it's, well, we redline this document, but this one paragraph is the really important stuff that we spent 5 days negotiating, going backwards and forwards. The rest of the red lines are kind of like, whatever. But ultimately, this is the most important. They kind of, I think there's a word coming, again, a nice new thing, but it's called decision tracers. But ultimately, those decision tracers are how do I capture the change? And in your, in your legislative world, that's why did the legislative body go through this? And that's like, how do you capture information about, white papers, green papers, the debate in Hansard, all that stuff that we've always talked about for many, many years, never quite captured it. It's very important to this AI to say, why do I make a choice to do X, Y, or Z? Or, we start to think about automating non-deterministic automation of processes. I don't think we've captured why people did things, or they are across all these different things, and can I, it'd be a challenge. I'm not in this world anymore, but in the challenge of, in your world would be, why did a regulator change this? What was the decision? How did it track its way through from a white paper and a memo to a advisory note to a rule change to a coming into rule change? When does it come into force? I think that's where people are now trying to capture that information, but I think it's still an incredibly hard thing to capture.
Indeed, yeah, indeed. And then there's differences in jurisprudence across jurisdictions with respect to that stuff. I mean, in some places it's literally a four corners type situation. If it's not,
100%.
And in others it's we go all the way back to committee reports and Hansard and
an unwritten constitution, right?
Yeah, exactly. So let's take a zip forward then. So in recent years, I've noticed that on your LinkedIn posts, you have been strong on the concept of information architecture and its relevance, and perhaps increasing relevance in the world of AI. Is that something you can speak to?
Yeah, I coined this phrase on a bus going through Peckham once, and may have had a few drinks. And it was just on Twitter, and it was a kind of I just left a meeting internally at a firm before I worked in this role. And what I really loved was the kind of the business analyst / IT person had basically said, I'm not coding anything until you go in, you pull up some columns in Excel, show me how, if we had this data, we would be able to answer your question, but I'm not building a database. I'm not pulling data, cleaning data, etc., until you show me that this is useful. And I coined this phrase of IA before AI, of saying, actually, we probably, before we AI anything, we should start to think about what the problem is. Then we should think about what would I need to answer that question, and then how do I get it? And I think what people do a little bit is let's make something up. Let's say there is a question to something that I want business or legal, and we sit down on a whiteboard and come up with 20 data points which I need to understand before I can then make that decision. Now, I might then go through and say, where are those data points? And you might point to an Excel file, then you might point to a structured database, then you might point to something I might extract from a contract. But, let's say 3 of the data points are those decision traces. They are what's in someone's head. And then normally tech people switch off and they go, well, you never get that. But we can get the other 17. And you're going, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you get the other 17 because you haven't got those 3.
Right.
And I think people need to think through a little bit more. It's a bit like even with the AI stuff, it's like, what's the data source which I'm doing? And do I trust that data source? And will it give me a biased answer or an incorrect answer? So I always kind of got back to, if we want to solve this problem, whether it's search or analytics or, feeding AI the right documents or the right context on those documents, is you've got to go back to the information architecture and say, how do I get the pieces of information, big text, small text, fields, and then you start looking, you start digging into the wormhole in some ways, and then you suddenly realize that, you sit at a law firm or an organization, a corporate, they've got 6 systems, and those 6 systems have got 6 different versions of Alex Smith in. They're not always the same, not always named the same, etc. So you then start to go, okay, so if, whether it's a boring way of extracting stuff and sticking it into a database, or it's a, model context protocol dynamics, the stuff, you're still going to know what you're doing, how you're going to unpick the lack of consistency of data. And I think that's what people got to think about. And I think they've got to think, it's not just on structured data. It's if you need to go into a contract, where is it? What am I looking for? What do I need to pull out? And I might be able to pull out the clause, but can I pull out the date? And then can I assume the date because of the clause, which is related to another clause, which validates the date? So that to me it's problem solving. And then it's basically saying, do I have the information to do it? And it's, for me, what's interesting is you come over to professional services and knowledge work. Ultimately, it's kind of like what they produce is almost like publishing. They don't realize it because they release a document or a PDF or an Excel file or whatever it may be, or a PowerPoint. But ultimately, you're publishing something. And then how do you look after that publishing asset? Because a lot of time you're going back to stuff. You're going back and saying, what is this? Can I reuse it? Is this useful to this? Where's the trend in this? So I kind of look at it through a content lens, a context lens, but then what's the information architecture that I need to solve the problem?
Right.
And then it's like, well, what's the technique to do that? And in my day job, it's about and what's the cost of that? Like, can I
Yeah.
burn every token in the world trying to find that one data point, or is it
Yeah.
easier
Yeah.
just to kind of pop something up in the interface saying, "Tell me why you did this"?
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
So kind of that's kind of where I go to, and I think as we look at all this kind of the AI stuff, it's starting to say, well, context is coming out. Like, I
Yeah.
need to know who the person is, what practice group they work in, what's their preference, where do they went to law school, all this kind of stuff suddenly becomes just more and more structured information. Now,
Yeah. I know.
ideally, that's that could be pulled on the fly. It could be highly structured. It could be classified. It could be extracted. It could be part of the publishing process when someone puts something in.
Yeah.
But you're not going to answer questions without that underlying information architecture,
Yeah.
because
Yeah. Yeah.
free forming across a load of data is just not going to work.
No, no, no. Agreed, agreed. I think part of what complicates it even further is that, one of the distinguishing features of the whole probabilistic large language model thing is, things look like answers, right? It fails silently, right? It in the good old days, if you had a null, say, in a field in a database, right,
Yeah,
then maybe you get a stack trace or something, uh, but now what happens is you get very plausible looking
yeah,
results, that, as you say, might be fundamentally flawed because there were a few different data points that the thing just didn't have to work with.
yeah,
And it has that, you know, you can't query its logic because it's not arriving at the results using the kind of traditional logic. I
yeah.
sometimes the analogy I've used to try and explain it to some folks um, is this great Indian mathematician by the name of Ramanujan. And if you know
No,
Ramanujan's
but
story, Ramanujan was came across to work with an English mathematician in Cambridge, I think back in the 40s, 50s. Um, and he came to that mathematician's attention because Ramanujan would just send over these, he just a big mathematical formula and just basically announce, oh, this is true, with no proof whatsoever. But a whole bunch of what he produced, Ramanujan produced, was incredibly deep, novel and true.
yeah.
But also a bunch of it was complete nonsense. But Ramanujan couldn't tell the difference because Ramanujan apparently, when asked, well, where do you get this stuff from? He would say, well, I get it from Shiva, and he's just writing it down.
Yeah,
So there's an element of that with the AIs, isn't it? Is that they write out something which looks very compelling,
yeah.
um, um, can't explain to you how it came to be, and
Yeah.
then you're left holding the bag then with respect to validating all of that.
Yeah, and as an expert or a professional, you're kind of now going, how do I go backwards? What's the right? Where
Yeah,
do I need to then send this? And I think validation's going to become a very, very important thing. I don't think it means that validation in the way that probably you and I have always done
right.
validation, but it is validation on, well, where did you get this from? Which bit of the document did you get this from? Was that updated? Does that entity even exist? Which is the
Right.
kind of thing at the moment. So, then it's going to say, well, where is my database? Where's my
Yeah.
I was never a big fan of blockchain, but they had this whole idea of oracles,
Right.
so basically saying, if you're going to build this, if then, yeah, pay insurance, then you need to know what the temperature was
Right.
in Canada on a certain day at a certain time when the boat did X. You
Right.
need an oracle. So where is the oracle? You can't make that up. There has to be a database somewhere of that, and
Yeah.
or there has to be the US constitutional state law has to be somewhere where you can then send it to validate that state law
Right.
exists and it fits within that criteria, and then et cetera, et cetera. So,
Yeah.
I think we are getting back to, in some ways, I don't never really like the term oracles. It sounds very Greek, but and obviously the oracles didn't. They were vibes as well. But but you get back to, okay, here's an oracle of what is X, and then people are going to have to start to say, okay, what do I trust this? And I've always found it quite funny because isn't a lot of this stuff trained on Wikipedia, which is ultimately a non-AI generated community expert, highly structured piece of information, highly validated, highly policed piece of information, and a lot of all these answers and various AI tools from Google search now into this is if Wikipedia didn't exist, a lot of this stuff might not be around.
That is true. Yeah, no, very true, very true. And of course, the web itself is all, one of the great moments in history, I think, was the moment when Sir Tim Berners-Lee decided, oh yeah, URLs, let them break.
Yeah.
Let's call it 404, move on, right?
I always quite liked his dual way linking, because that actually felt like a proper knowledge system. Like, does this exist, if that, but it was never going to survive marketing and other own commerciality.
So I can see why we've ended up, I can see why he made the decision he did. And I think many benefits have come from it. But, link rot is real. Is perhaps becoming a bigger problem, now than it ever did. I sometimes, I think, every profession, I think every profession that's been around a long time, has something to teach us, I think, and I think in the world of law, one of the ones that I've always liked is this idea of shepherdizing. Obviously, this is as well from Lexis's days, right? Which is
citations and checking.
And the fact that the citation is checkable.
Yeah.
That I don't know how many hundreds of years ago was that. That's a long, long time ago.
So I think it's over 100 years. Shepherds.
Yeah,
20 or something like that.
Yeah, there's something timeless about that idea.
Yeah.
And I think really what we're going to need to do, if the dust ever does settle around here on all of this stuff, is we're going to have to start finding, as you say, ways of getting to those kind of oracle type things, ways of taking that concept of shepherdizing it and applying it more broadly.
I do worry. I do wonder, not worry, some of the interesting areas pre-AI, or pre this wave of AI were standardization. And basically saying that, it was often for efficiency. Like, why are lawyers rewriting these types of contracts? It's the same type of thing. People want to get the deal done. I think it was banking was one of the big ones in the UK. And people got together for a decade and worked out what standards were and started to say, here is the standard, etc. I wonder if AI and kind of oracles start to become something which drive people to standardization, because otherwise that's unvalidated. Now, obviously, there's different organizations want competitive advantage, so their drafting's better than someone else's, etc. That's fine. But they have to deal with their knowledge problem there. That becomes their knowledge asset that they need to start to manage better than probably they have to some degree before. But I do wonder whether standards start to emerge, if we can compute through this stuff quicker, and then add the human aspect to it. Do we start to create oracles which are trusted in banking or real estate or or tax and audit, for example, and then do those, I feel a bit sorry, because obviously quite a lot of the time for regulators, they don't have the funding for, these big projects, right? You'll know, you tried to get checks off many of them. It's a long time period. It can be 3-4 years. It's a big project to do something, to, publish things that aren't PDF, for example. But, I wonder whether you'll start to see some way where some of the regulators or the standards bodies start to become the authority that becomes the things that you would point your AI at and say, you point it here, you're less likely to end up with professional indemnity or a professional issue because this is trusted. Obviously, the publishers still have a lot of power around that because they have the most of this content. But I do wonder whether, especially in areas where I'm not going to say I worry less about the larger organizations, but the larger organizations can do this, right? They can build data warehouses. They're going to spend time using AI to clean up their document management and their information architecture and all that stuff. But you've got to kind of also remember that a large chunk of law is kind of like not in the lawyers don't cover it. And a lot of that's in public and private piece. Obviously in this country, there's a lot of litigants in person going into courts and they're using ChatGPT. and they're coming up with, here's my prompt is send me a slightly lawyerly yet threatening letter to my landlord, etc., etc. And you hear these stories about someone who's going, "Oh my God, the landlord dropped the price because I sent something that looked like from a lawyer." That's fun, but it's not that's not good long term. People are kind of using a tool which isn't trusted to come up with the wrong law to then end up in you end up in court with your life on the line or your money on the line or your divorce on the line or whatever it is. And I think we're going to have to think about this probably at a more, our government's going to have to spend more money doing the things that they never really did with your types of tools, right? Of actually putting in place, consolidated legislation. What does that actually mean? And validating that the quick start guide to the Companies Act is trusted and validated, etc. Knowing that these tools are going to index it and then give advice. And I use the term very loosely, advice to citizens. And I'm not saying that's bad, right? Because citizens are often very poorly supported by the lack of plain language around law, right? But the flip is that you are going to see more people pressing buttons and saying, "Here is my complaint letter," or "Here's my filled in form against someone."
Indeed. Yeah, I mean, one of my hobby horses is occasionally I'll see yet another reference to some jurisdiction deciding that it's going to set up its own sovereign AI. And but my 2 cents is that really what they should do is this a sovereign data set. That's what they should do. Which has all the attributes that you alluded to there, right? In terms of reliability, concentrate on the data problems and let the AIs continue to do whatever because you can't stop them anyway. But give them authoritative data that's citable.
I mean, you know where a lot of this data is, right? The data's coming, if you really dig into the articles and kind of have an information architecture data search piece, the sources of some of the stuff this is trained on is worrying. And it's coming from indexes, that there's some really worrying data sets, but let's leave that aside. It's coming from the big indexes that are being Google, etc., or people re-indexing again when they fall out with Bing or Google. But what Bing and Google are indexing, right? It's often the unconsolidated legislation. It's the overview by not the most reputable organization of case law. And so ultimately that's all in the numbers and in the system and the ones and zeros, as you say. And so, is it a government responsibility or a regulator responsibility to make sure that they publish consolidated legislation, that they suddenly do have to invest in publishing case law publicly, because otherwise, incomplete data sets lead to incomplete answers or misleading answers.
No, indeed.
And that goes a long way, right? We're very privileged here for whatever 30 odd years of some amazing people at John Sheridan and those guys. But you publish for many other countries. It's a very long way away from that, even in places like America, right, where a lot of that legislation is, as you said, hidden, or it still goes through publishers. It still goes through 3-year life cycles before it's updated.
Right.
And where does money come from all of that, right? We're not always overflowing with money, public money to do these projects.
Absolutely true. Gosh, we could talk for hours on this stuff, Alex. Gosh, that hour flew by. I'm really, really grateful for you making the time to talk.
So we should do this again, maybe with a whiteboard or something.
Yeah, exactly. Let's do a little whiteboard.
We'll do it with Claude. We'll do a live asking Claude stuff.
Yeah, you and I and Claude will have a conversation.
Yeah, it's a bit where you end up arguing, saying, no, that's not the right answer, and you went to the wrong place.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for your time today, Alex. Appreciate it.
No, good. Thank you.